The door of the North Tower closed with a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. A low iron groan, followed by the turn of a key that had not been turned in 30 years. Eleanor stood very still in the cold round room and listened to her husband's boots descend the spiral stair, unhurried as a man walks who believes he has settled a matter. Below her, the great house of Whitcomb Hall hummed with the first arrivals of the autumn assembly, the carriages on the gravel, the violins tuning behind the long windows, the laughter of people who had come a great distance to watch a duchess fall. She did not weep. She crossed to the narrow casement, set her cold fingers against the older, colder glass, and looked out across the park where the lamps were being lit one by one along the carriage drive. To the county gathered below, she was already a settled thing, a woman put away. The Duke's mistake, quietly corrected before the harvest, they did not know what she knew. They did not know that 4 days ago, before any of this began, she had already sent the letters. You may want to stay with this one to the end, because what looks like a locked door is not always a locked door. Let me tell you how a quiet woman came to be standing in a tower, while the man who put her there still believed he had won. Her name was Eleanor Hartley before it was anything grander, and 3 years earlier she had married Adrian, the Duke of Whitcomb, in a chapel so cold the vicar's breath had hung in the air like smoke. It had not been a love match in the way the ballads meant it. His first wife had died in the second winter of their marriage, a young woman named Catherine, whom the household still spoke of in the lowered voice reserved for the recently and unfairly dead. And Adrian had married again within the year because the estate required a settled mistress. And his late mother's sister had told him plainly that grief was not a strategy. Eleanor came with a modest portion, a clever head she had learned to keep lowered, and a father lately buried who had left her nothing but his good name, and a single worn miniature of her mother, painted on ivory no larger than a walnut. She had arrived at Whitcomb expecting to be useful and overlooked. She had not expected to be feared, for the dowager feared her, and the dowager was the true power at Whitcomb Hall. Lady Margaret Whitcomb, the Duke's father's widow, had run the estate through the long minority of her stepson and the short reign of the first Duchess, and she did not intend to surrender it to a Hartley girl with chapped wrists and provincial vowels. She was a woman of 70, with a straight back and a soft voice, and she wounded the way frost wounds, slowly and without apparent malice. To the dowager, Eleanor was a temporary inconvenience, a stopgap, a woman the family had taken in out of charity and could put down again when something better was found. She said as much the first week, in the morning room, to the rector's wife, with Eleanor pouring the tea, not 3 feet away. She is a charity wife, and nothing more, the dowager said. And the words went into Eleanor like cold water down a collar. Eleanor did not spill the tea. She set the pot down without a sound. She folded her hands in her lap, and she let the label settle on her shoulders where it would sit for the next 3 years. A charity wife. The household took up the phrase, the way households do, never to her face, always within her hearing, in the slowed step of a footman, in the small adjustment of a curtsy, in the way the housekeeper waited for the dowager's nod before she would accept an instruction from the Duchess. Eleanor learned the geography of her own diminishment as a traveler learns a foreign country, and she learned it without complaint, because she had learned long ago that complaint was a luxury for women whose worth was not in question. What she did, instead, was work. She did not announce it. She rose before the maids and went down to the steward's office, where the great ledgers of the estate were kept, and she taught herself the bones of Whitcomb, in the gray hours before the house woke. She learned that the home farm had been bleeding money for 4 years, because a bailiff named Coulter was selling the Duke's grain twice, once to the market, and once on paper to the Duke. She learned that 3 tenant families had been turned off their holdings in the spring on the dowager's order, while the Duke was in town, and that one of those families, the Brewers, had a sick child who had died on the road to Bristol. She learned the estate as a body learns its own ache, and she said nothing to anyone because she did not yet know whom she could trust, and because a charity wife who speaks of the accounts is a charity wife who is removed. The Duke himself she could not read at all. Adrian of Whitcomb was a tall man of 32 with dark hair and a jaw like the edge of a struck flint, and he moved through his own house like a man visiting a place he half remembered. He was not cruel to her. He was not anything to her. He spoke to her at dinner of the weather and the roads, and, once memorably, of a horse, and his eyes, when they rested on her, had the flat courtesy of a man looking at a chair he intends to keep. She told herself she had not married for warmth, and she was not owed it. She told herself this in the long evenings, while he sat at the far end of a table built to seat 30, and the candles guttered between them like a question neither would ask. What she did not know in those first 2 years was that he watched her more closely than any man in that house. She did not see how his hands stilled on his glass the evening she came in late from the home farm with mud on her hem, and gave the steward an instruction about the Brewer cottage in a voice no one had heard her use. She did not see him in the gallery window the morning she walked the youngest scullery maid, a girl of 9 who had scalded her arm at the copper, all the way to the apothecary in the village herself, rather than send her with a footman who would not have waited. It had been raining that morning, a thin, cold rain, and Eleanor had taken off her own shawl and wrapped the girl's shoulders in it, and held an umbrella over the child the whole 2 miles while the wet came through her own sleeves. At the apothecary she had paid for the salve from her own small purse, and she had sat on the bench among the sacks of dried herbs, and held the girl's good hand while the man dressed the burn, and she had told the child a foolish story about a cat that learned to fish, to take her mind off the sting. The girl had laughed. Eleanor had walked her back through the rain and delivered her to the kitchen, and said nothing of it to anyone. She did not see because she had stopped expecting to be seen, and a woman who has stopped expecting it grows a particular kind of blindness toward the evidence that she is. The Duke had stood at the gallery window the whole time and watched his Duchess go out into the cold for a scullery maid, and had said nothing, either, and had gone down afterward to the apothecary and quietly paid the man twice what the salve was worth, and had told him to send to the hall in future for whatever any of the Whitcomb people needed. The first time she felt the floor shift beneath her was a wet October afternoon in the library. She had gone in to return a volume of estate maps and found him there before the fire, a letter open in his hand. His face turned to the window where the rain came down the glass in long gray ropes. He did not hear her at first. The letter was old. She could see that, even from the doorway, the paper soft and much folded, the ink browned, and his thumb moved across it slowly, as a man reads a thing he has read 100 times and cannot stop reading. She saw before he composed himself something she had never seen on that flint face, a grief so old and so private that she felt she had walked into a room where someone was undressing. His hand had gone to his breast pocket where she would later learn he carried a thing he never showed, and his mouth had shaped a word she could not hear. A woman's name, she thought, a single, soft syllable spent on the rain. Then he turned and saw her, and the flint came down again like a portcullis, and the letter was folded away into the breast pocket with the swift, sure motion of long habit, and the man who had been grieving a moment before was gone as though he had never been there at all. "You are wet through," he said. The words were not warm. The words were an accusation. "Sit by the fire. You will catch your death walking the grounds in this." It was a command, level and cold, the kind of thing he might have said to a groom. She sat, because it was easier than refusing, and she held her cold hands to the fire, and she was aware of him standing behind her chair with the strange attention of a man guarding something. She told herself it meant nothing. Her hands, against her instruction, would not quite stop trembling, and it was not entirely the cold. The trouble came in earnest with the arrival of 2 people. The first was a young woman, the second was a cousin, and between them they would build the trap that ended with Eleanor in the tower. The young woman was Lady Sophia Verena, a diamond of 2 seasons, the dowager's goddaughter, and she arrived for the autumn, with a maid, a harp, and a settled understanding of her own destiny. She was beautiful in the way that is bred rather than born, gold-haired and ice-blue and certain, and she had been raised on the expectation that she would one day be the Duchess of Whitcomb, an expectation the first Duchess and then the Hartley girl had only postponed. She moved through the house as though the Hartley girl were a piece of furniture left by a previous tenant, and the Dowager moved her forward at every opportunity, into the Duke's path, into the chair at his right hand, into the conversation with the patient hand of a woman placing a winning card she has held a long time. The cousin was worse. Mr. Crispin Hartley was Eleanor's own kinsman, a second cousin on her father's side. A soft-handed man with debts in 3 counties and a smile he had practiced in glass. He arrived uninvited in September, was received because the Duke would not turn off a guest before the county, and within a week he had understood the lie of the land at Whitcomb better than Eleanor had in 2 years. He understood that the Dowager wanted the Duchess gone. He understood that he himself was the nearest male of Eleanor's blood, and that if her marriage could be unmade, certain settlements made at her wedding, certain moneys tied to her person, would fall to be administered by her family. He understood, in short, that there was a fortune to be had if a charity wife could be proved a worthless one, and he set himself to the proving with the quiet industry of a man who has never in his life done honest work. It was Crispin who found the thing the Dowager had only wished for. Going through the steward's office one evening, where Eleanor had been working in secret for 2 years, he found her notes, her careful copied figures, her record of Coulter's double-dealing and the Dowager's evictions and the dead Brewer child. He did not understand what he was looking at, but he understood that it was dangerous, and being a clever man in the small way of clever men, he carried it not to the Duke, but to the Dowager. Lady Margaret read the pages with a still face. Here was the charity wife, the stopgap, the provincial girl in possession of every secret the estate kept, the bailiff's theft, the evictions done in the Duke's name, and without his knowledge the whole rotten underside of Whitcomb, copied out in a neat, clean hand. A clever wife is more dangerous than a foolish one. The Dowager had spent 3 years calling Eleanor a charity wife to make her small, and now she found she had been small about the wrong thing. Entirely. So she changed the story. If the Duchess held the estate's secrets, then the Duchess was the source of them. The thefts, the evictions, the ruin of the home farm, all of it could be laid at the door of a grasping, low-born wife who had been bleeding the estate from the first, and the notes in her own hand would be the proof. The Dowager took this story to her stepson on a grey morning in October, with Crispin to swear to the finding of the papers and Lady Sophia to sit pale and wronged in the corner. And she did it well, because she believed a great part of it, because the truest liars are the ones who have first lied to themselves. The Duke did not rage. Eleanor would have preferred rage. He came to her in the morning room, where she sat with her mother's miniature in her hand, as she often did when the house pressed too close, and he stood in the doorway with the papers in his fist and his face like the north face of a cliff. "You have been in my accounts," he said. "Yes," she said. She did not lie. She had never lied to him. And she did not begin now. "I have. For 2 years," he said. "For 2 years." She agreed. He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something she was too frightened to read. And then the Dowager's voice came from behind him, soft and grieved, saying the second voicing of the thing that had followed Eleanor for 3 years. "We took her in out of charity," Lady Margaret said, "and this is the charity wife's gratitude, to rob the house that fed her." The words were spoken to the Duke, in the public space of the open door, with Crispin and a footman to hear, and they were spoken to wombed, and they wounded. The Duke turned the papers over in his hand. He did not ask her why a thief would copy out the evidence of her own theft in her own hand and leave it where it might be found. He did not ask, and she watched him not ask, and she understood that he had chosen, in that moment, to believe the easier thing, because the easier thing did not require him to feel anything, and feeling, she had long suspected, was the one thing this man could not afford. "You will go to the North Tower," he said, "until the assembly is passed, and I have decided what is to be done with you." It was a command, level and cold. It was the cruelest thing he had ever said to her. And yet, because she had spent 3 years learning to read the small print beneath his orders, she heard, underneath the cold, something that did not fit, a roughness in the word tower, the smallest catch, as though some part of him were issuing a command he did not himself understand. She filed it away. She had learned to file things away. What none of them knew, not the Dowager, not Crispin, not Sophia, not the Duke himself, was that Eleanor had not been idle in the 4 days since Crispin's smile had first turned cold at the dinner table. She had seen the shape of the thing coming the way a farmer sees weather. And so, before they ever moved against her, she had moved first. She had written letters, 3 of them, in her clean, clear hand, the same hand that had copied out the ledgers.
The first.
She had written to the magistrate of the county, Sir Henry Aldous, an old upright man who had known her father, and in it she had laid out plainly the matter of Coulter, the bailiff, and the double-sold grain, with dates and figures he could verify against the market books in Bristol. The second, she had written to the Duke's own man of business in London, a solicitor named Pruitt, enclosing copies of the eviction orders that bore the Dowager's signature and not the Duke's, and asking, as the Duchess of the estate, that the matter be examined. The third, and this was the one she had thought longest over, she had written to a woman named Mrs. Brewer, the mother of the dead child, who had gone to live with her sister in the next county, and in it she had told the truth of what had happened, and promised, on her honor as the Duchess of Whitcomb, that it would be set right. She had sent the letters by the carrier on a Tuesday 4 days before the assembly, before Crispin found the papers, before the Dowager built her story, before the Tower. She had sent them not knowing how the trap would close, only certain that it would. And then she had let it close, because a trap that closes on a woman who has already sent the letters is not a trap. It is a stage. While she sat in the Tower listening to the violins, the letters were already doing their slow work. Sir Henry, the magistrate, had read his and ridden to Bristol himself to look at the market books, and had found Coulter's name in them and the Duke's grain sold under it, and he had not liked what the finding implied about a great house in his county. The solicitor Pruitt in London had read his and gone very pale, because a forged eviction order is a serious thing, and a Duke's name forged upon it more serious still, and he had set out for Whitcomb by the fastest post-chaise he could hire. And Mrs. Six Brewer had read hers, weeping, and had shown it to the curate who had shown it to others, until the truth of the Brewer child ran through the villages around Whitcomb like water, finding its level, and the county that had come to watch a duchess fall began, in its kitchens and its stable yards, to hear a different story. If you have ever been told that you are nothing, hold on a moment longer, because the woman in the Tower had been told it for 3 years, and she was about to find out that the telling and the truth are not the same thing. Now let me bring you to the night it all came down. The assembly at Whitcomb Hall was the great event of the county autumn, and the Dowager had planned this one with particular care, for it was to be the night Lady Sophia Verena was presented to the county as the future of the house, the Duke's wife in all but name, the proper diamond who would replace the charity wife now. The ballroom blazed. 400 candles burned in the great chandeliers. The long terrace doors stood open to the cold, bright October night. The orchestra played, and the cream of 3 counties turned and turned beneath the painted ceiling, where Whitcomb ancestors looked down in oils gone amber with age. Lady Margaret sat in state at the head of the room in grey silk and the Whitcomb diamonds with Sophia gold and glowing at her side, and she surveyed her work and found it good. The Duke did not dance. He stood near the terrace doors with a glass he did not drink, and to the county he looked, as he always looked, cold and contained and unreachable. The man no one approached. Yet a footman who had served him 15 years might have noticed that his eyes went again and again to the dark archway at the foot of the great stair, the archway that led to the North Range, and that each time they went there, a muscle moved in his jaw and was stilled. He had locked a door that morning. He had been telling himself all day that he had done a necessary thing. He had been failing all day to believe it. Eleanor had not been idle in the tower either. She had a small thing the dowager did not know she had, a key given to her 2 years before by the old housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, who was the loyal anchor of this story, though no one had yet named her so. Mrs. Proms. Finch had served the first Duchess, and had loved her, and had watched the second Duchess walk the scalded scullery maid to the village with her own hands, and had made up her own mind about charity wives. The key opened a servant's stair that ran inside the wall of the north range, a stair the family had forgotten and the servants had not, and it came up behind a screen in the long gallery above the ballroom. Mrs. Finch had brought Eleanor her supper that evening, and under the napkin had been not bread but a folded note, and the note had said only, "The magistrate is below, and Pruitt has come from London, and they are asking for the Duchess." So Eleanor dressed. Not in finery, for she had none, but in the plain dark gown she had been married in, and she took up her mother's miniature and held it a moment in her closed hand. And then she went down the forgotten stair in the wall, while 400 candles burned on the other side of the stone. The reversal, when it came quietly, as the best reversals do. The orchestra had paused between dances. The dowager had risen to make her presentation, had drawn Lady Sophia forward by the hand, had opened her mouth to speak the words that would seat the diamond in the dead Duchess's place, and into that pause, into that bright, expectant silence, an old man in traveling dress walked through the great doors unannounced, with mud to his knees and a leather case under his arm, and behind him came a pale London solicitor, and behind them both came the magistrate of the county, Sir Henry Aldous, with his hat in his hand and his face set hard. Lady Margaret faltered. The presentation died in her throat. And before she could recover it, before anyone could, a screen moved at the gallery rail above, and the county looked up, and there at the rail in her plain dark wedding gown stood the Duchess they had all been told was put away. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She had never needed to raise her voice. She looked down at the bright upturned faces, and she found the magistrate's eyes, and she said, in the carrying quiet of a woman who has nothing left to lose, "Sir Henry, I believe you have read my letter." The room came apart in whispers. Sir Henry bowed to the gallery gravely. "The beau a magistrate gives to a duchess," and he said loudly enough for the painted ceiling to hear it, "I have, your grace, and I have ridden to Bristol on the strength of it, and I find every word of it true." And then, to the room, to the dowager standing frozen with Sophia's hand still in hers, he laid it out. The bailiff Coulter and the grain sold twice. The eviction order signed in a hand that was not the Duke's, the Brewer family turned off, and the child dead on the Bristol road. The solicitor Pruitt stepped forward and confirmed the forgery in his dry London voice, and held up the orders, and the dowager's own signature was on them for the county to see. It was the third voicing that broke her. The dowager, cornered white, reaching for the only weapon she had ever needed, turned to her stepson and said the thing one final time, her voice climbing toward the painted ceiling. "She is a charity wife, Adrian, a low-born schemer. Will you take her word over your own family?" Yet the room had heard the magistrate now, and the words that had wounded for 3 years fell into the bright air and found nothing to land on. And the dowager heard them fall, and the confidence of 70 years cracked across her face like ice across a river in a thaw. The Duke crossed the room. He did not run. He crossed the floor of his own ballroom in long, even strides, while 400 candles burned and 3 counties watched. And he went not to the dowager, and not to the magistrate, but to the foot of the great stair, and he looked up at the woman in the plain dark gown at the gallery rail, and the flint was gone from his face entirely, and what was under it the whole county saw he had reached into his breast pocket. In his open hand, where the room could see it, lay a thing he had carried for 3 years and shown to no one, a small worn miniature on ivory, the twin of the one in Eleanor's hand, the portrait of her mother she had thought lost on the journey to Whitcomb and had mourned in silence. He had found it in the carriage the day she came. He had carried it every day since. "This is my wife," he said, "the Duchess of Whitcomb. There is no other." 12 words, no more, level and clear. And they ended the dowager's reign in the house she had ruled for 30 years, and they were spoken in the very room where she had ruled it. He did not say more. He did not need to. The minimum sufficient thing had been said, and the room, released, broke into a sound like a held breath let go, and Lady Sophia drew her hand from the dowager's slack fingers and stepped back again, removing herself from a field that was lost. What came after was procedure, and Eleanor had arranged for the procedure too. Sir Henry took Crispin Hartley into the small library, and a constable was sent for, and the matter of the forged orders was made the magistrate's business and not the family's, which meant it could not be quietly undone. Coulter the bailiff was gone by morning, and taken at Bristol by the week's end, his ledgers seized and his double accounts laid open for any man to read. The dowager was not dragged through the courts, for Eleanor would not have it, and this surprised the county more than anything else that night. "She is old," Eleanor said, when the Duke asked her what she wished done, "and she has lost the only thing she ever valued, which was the running of this house. Let that be enough." It was the mercy of a woman who had been shown none, and it was the last lesson the dowager ever learned at Whitcomb, that the charity wife had more grace in her than the whole house had ever credited her with. The Duke came to her at last in the emptying ballroom, when the candles were guttering, and the orchestra had packed away its instruments, and the great room smelled of wax and crushed flowers and the cold air off the terrace. They stood a proper distance apart as they had stood for 3 years, and for a long moment neither spoke. "You knew," he said. "Before the Tower you had already sent them." 4 days before, she said. "Then why," he said, and his voice was not level now, "why did you let me lock the door?" She looked at him. This man of flint, who had carried her mother's face against his heart for 3 years, and never said a word, and she understood him at last. The whole of him. The wife he believed he had failed. The grief he had turned to stone rather than feel. The way he had learned that to want a thing was to risk losing it, and so had taught himself to want nothing. Least of all her, because, she said, "I needed to know what you would do. And I needed you to know it too." He took a step toward her. It was the first time in 3 years he had closed the distance rather than holding it. His hand came up and stopped hovering a breath from her face, not touching, the discipline of 3 years warring with the thing the whole county had just watched break in him. She felt the warmth of his hand without the touch of it. Her heart was loud in her throat. She did not move away. "Eleanor," he said. Only her name. The first time he had ever used it. He had called her "Your Grace" and "Madam" and "You" for 3 years, and now in the wreck of the ballroom, he said her given name as though he were laying something down that he had carried too long, and the saying of it was the whole confession he did not have the words for. "I have been a coward," he said, "in the only way that frightened me. I saw what you were within a month, and I could not bear to want it, because the last thing I wanted I buried in the second winter, and I told myself that if I felt nothing, I could lose nothing." He stopped. His hand still hovered. "I was wrong about everything. Except you." She closed the last of the distance herself. She turned her face, the small fraction it took to bring her cheek against his open palm, and his hand, when at last it touched her, was not steady at all. She felt the calluses of a man who rode his own land, and the slight tremor he could not master, the warmth of him after 3 years of cold, and her own breath came short, in a way that had nothing to do with the chill off the open terrace doors. She had told herself for 3 years that she did not want this. Her body had been telling her otherwise for almost as long, in the quickening of her pulse when he entered a room. In the way she always knew exactly where he stood without turning to look, and now in the empty ballroom, her body finished the argument her mind had lost. He drew her in slowly, the way a man handles a thing he has decided he cannot afford to break. And he held her in the empty ballroom, under the eyes of the painted ancestors, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing further that needed saying. His mouth came to her temple, to her hair, and stopped there, soft and full of a promise that would keep, and they stood a long time in the smell of guttered wax, while the last footman pretended not to see. And Mrs. Finch, in the doorway, wept into her apron, and did not pretend anything at all. If this story has moved you, you might tell me which moment stayed with you. Stay a moment more, for there is one image left, and it is the one I most wanted you to have. The first snow came to Whitcomb before December, early and soft, the way it does in years the old people call kind. It lay on the park and the carriage drive and the bare autumn trees, and it lay on the roof of the North Tower, where a door now stood always open, for the Duke had ordered the lock taken off the morning after the assembly, and had carried the iron down to the smithy himself. Inside the house, the fires were lit. In the small morning room that had once been the coldest place Eleanor knew, the one where she had sat with her mother's face in her hand and heard herself called a charity wife, a fire now burned high in the grate, and the room was warm, and it was hers. She sat by the window with the snow coming down beyond the glass. On the small table beside her lay the two miniatures, her mother's twin portraits, side by side at last, the one she had carried and the one he had carried, and they were so alike that a stranger could not have told which had crossed the years in whose keeping. The Brewer family had been brought back to a good holding on the home farm, and Mrs. Brewer had sent by way of the curate a single pressed flower from her sister's garden, a thing of no value at all, and it lay between the two miniatures where Eleanor had set it. Mrs. Finch came in with the tea, and set it down without waiting for any nod from anyone, because there was no longer anyone in the house whose nod she required, and she touched the Duchess's shoulder on her way out, lightly, the way you touch a thing you have helped to mend. The Duke came in from the cold, with snow in his dark hair. He did not sit at the far end of any table. He crossed the warm room and stood behind her chair, and looked out at the falling snow over the top of her head, and, after a moment, his hand came to rest on her shoulder where Mrs. Finch's had been, and stayed. He had brought a book under his arm, she saw, and he meant to read by her fire, in her room, in the easy nearness of people who no longer measure the distance between them. Below them, somewhere in the house, a child of the household was laughing, a sound the old stones had not heard in a long time. Eleanor reached up and laid her cold hand over his warm one, and they watched the snow fall on the park that was theirs, and on the open tower, and on the long drive where the lamps would not need lighting tonight, for no one was coming and no one was leaving, and the house at last was quiet in the way that means a thing is well. She had sent the letters before the door was ever locked, and the snow came down and covered the road, and the Duchess of Whitcomb was home. Thank you for staying until the end.